You are watching Bengals Breakdown, and I am your host, Stone Shields. Coming up on today's show, we're going to be talking about what Colin Cowherd had to say about the Cincinnati Bengals. He basically said that he thinks Joe Burrow could potentially be the next Matthew Stafford in Detroit. Obviously, Stafford in Detroit. That was 11 years of football, no playoff wins, and ultimately a great talent kind of wasted in the city of Detroit. So I'm going to be disputing that here on today's show, so make sure you stick around throughout the entirety of today's video. But before we get into that, we are trying to knock over 400 likes off the board on today's show. So if you're excited for Cincinnati Bengals football, it's been training camp, right? We were talking about stuff leading up to training camp. Pretty soon here, we're going to be playing football, and that is exactly why we are all gathered here at the channel, is because we are fired up about that. So if you're excited, show your excitement by hitting that thumbs up icon, liking today's video right now, so we can try to get over 400 likes here on today's show. Well, here's my one-word reaction is no. Joe Burrow is not the next Matthew Stafford in Detroit. Look, I've gone on the record multiple times saying I absolutely love Colin Cowherd. Out of everybody that does his job, I think he does it the best. Sometimes his takes are not good ones. That's just the nature of the business. Come on. Joe Burrow's already won 5 playoff games, and we'll touch on that right here, right now, as our first point as to why he isn't the next Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford in Detroit, he was 0-3 in the postseason, didn't win a singular postseason game. Joe Burrow is entering year 6 here with the Cincinnati Bengals and already has a 5-2 playoff record, and his losses, of course, were in the Super Bowl and the AFC Championship game. So I think that, to me, is the main number one thing that stands out here, as if to say there's no reason that Joe Burrow is the next Matthew Stafford in Detroit. He's already had so much playoff success, and Stafford was in Detroit for 11 seasons. Joe Burrow is entering year 6, so he still has 5 more years to even get to that point as far as where Stafford was throughout the entirety of his career, and he already has blown that out of the water with 5 playoff wins. So that in itself should end the discussion right there, but we have more to get on as well. He also has consistency at head coach, right? Zach Taylor, of course, has been his coach throughout the entire time Joe Burrow has played professional football, and there are those out there that say that Zach Taylor should be on the hot seat going into this season. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but I can assure you Zach Taylor's going to be sticking around, right? Barring something disastrous here in the 2025 campaign, he will be sticking around, and that consistency will stay at the head coach spot for Joe Burrow throughout his time in the NFL. Is it going to be all of his career? I'm not going to go out there and say that necessarily, but Zach Taylor is going to be sticking around for the foreseeable future. Think about the guys that Matthew Stafford had to deal with in Detroit. Jim Schwartz, of course, was his first head coach. Then it was Jim Caldwell, which, by the way, that is just 2 completely different sides of the spectrum as far as approach and leadership goes when you're talking about Jim Schwartz, fiery, crazy guy, and a laid-back guy like Jim Caldwell. Also Matt Patricia and Darrell Bevell as well. Those are 4 head coaches throughout the time of Matthew Stafford's career in Detroit. Joe Burrow, obviously only going into year 6, he's had the same guy throughout the entirety of that process, and that continuity is big time, right? Because we talk about these quarterbacks that have to cycle through head coaches, offensive play callers. That is a lot. Joe Burrow hasn't had to deal with that here to this point. Obviously, Brian Callahan was his original offensive coordinator. Now it's Dan Pitcher, but it's the same tree, the same structure, and ultimately the same head coach in Zach Taylor. Are you worried about Joe Burrow perhaps being the next Matthew Stafford in Detroit? Let me know in the comment section of today's show, at the pinned comment, actually, of today's video. Type Y for yes or N for no. He also takes care of the ball a heck of a lot better than Matthew Stafford does. Look, Matthew Stafford, especially in his early days, you could even argue a little bit now in Los Angeles as well, as a gunslinger, right? He is always trying to show off that arm and fit it into tight windows, and it's caused him to throw a lot of interceptions as well. Joe Burrow's a guy that doesn't really turn the ball over via the INT, right? Does he have some sack fumbles? Sure, but he does a much better job at taking care of the football than Matthew Stafford. And I think it's important to point out, those Detroit teams around Stafford were lousy. Make absolutely no mistake about it. But there were some games as well that were close ball games that Stafford turned the ball over late in those games, and that caused Detroit not to win. You can pretty much always count on Joe Burrow protecting the football late in games. Obviously, there were a couple this past year where he turned the ball over in the fourth quarter. But for the most part, when it comes to taking care of the football, Joe Burrow does a much better job of that than Matthew Stafford early in his career. Matthew Stafford now, sure, great. He typically isn't a guy that's going to turn the football over. But earlier in his career, he was throwing it to the other team certainly more than a couple of times. And lastly here, and it kind of ties back to the first point, but they just win more games, flat out. Cincinnati wins more games than Detroit did with Matthew Stafford. Here are some of the seasons that Detroit had with Matthew Stafford quarterbacking them: 2-14, 6-10, 4-12, 6-10 again, 3-12-1, 7-9, 7-9. Bad seasons, lots of them, right? As a team perspective goes, as far as wins and losses, Joe Burrow really hasn't had that. 4-11-1 was his rookie season, and of course he blew out his knee and was not able to finish that season, right? And beyond that, in 2021, when he came back, you go what, 10-7, make the Super Bowl, right? And then you're what, 12-4 the following year, 12-5, maybe something like that when you go to the AFC Championship, and then a couple of 9-8 seasons. One, of course, when he got hurt with the wrist, and then last year he played the entirety of the season. But all winning seasons with Joe Burrow at the helm. Apart from that rookie campaign, Cincinnati ultimately just wins more games than Detroit did as well. So at the end of the day, I get it from Colin Cowherd, right? Kind of bringing this up, especially a lot of people saying, oh, it's, a crappy organization, what have you. I understand those comments, but to compare him to potentially being the next Matthew Stafford in Detroit, I think is a little ridiculous. Once again, trying to get to 400 likes here on today's video. So if you think the Bengals will make the playoffs, hit that thumbs up icon, right? All the pieces that they have in place: Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Joe Burrow. We'll see about Trey Hendrickson, of course. But if all those guys are healthy, this is a team that should make the playoffs. If you think they will, show it by liking today's video for me right now. All right, now to close out today's show, let's talk about Colin Cowherd's buddy over at FS1, Nick Wright, and what he had to say about the Cincinnati Bengals. He said, I think the Bengals are staring at a third straight year of missing the playoffs, and that should be unacceptable with that quarterback and those receivers. Now, I want to break down kind of what made Nick Wright say these things. Number one, he didn't like the firing of Lou Anarumo. Now, Nick Wright is pretty openly a Chiefs guy, and he goes on the air and he clearly is a Chiefs guy when he talks. And he didn't think the Bengals should have fired Lou Anarumo. Why? Because nobody is better at stopping the Chiefs or slowing down the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes than Lou Anarumo. We even saw that last year in Week 2. He was great. Anarumo was against the Kansas City Chiefs, so he didn't like that, and that was part of the reason why he has some angst, I guess, towards the Cincinnati Bengals and some belief that they're not potentially going to make the playoffs. So, as Bengal fans, we all understand it needed to happen. We all love and respect Lou, and he did great things, but you need to change at that spot. And unfortunately, that was kind of the head of the roll, so to speak, Lou Anarumo. Also, he says there's nothing to suggest that they'll be better than last year, right? He's like, you were 9-8 last year, and you had all these great pieces, and Burrow was, a guy that comeback player of the year, could have been an MVP guy. In my opinion, should have been the MVP, right? Jamar Chase wins the Triple Crown. What's different? That's kind of the point that Nick Wright is making. We'll come back to that in a second, but I understand that. He also thinks Joe Burrow is going to take a step back. And the analogy, or kind of the comparison he made, is talking about Saquon Barkley as well for Philadelphia. And he was like, that was an A+++ year for Saquon Barkley, and it certainly was for Joe Burrow as well. What happens if you retract that a little bit and that 100% goes to like a 95%? It's still an A and it's still really, really good, but his argument is, well, he was 100% and you still missed the playoffs, so he's a little bit worse than that. How the heck are you going to make the postseason? I get it, but that's kind of the last point to his rationale. What is your one-word reaction to Nick Wright's comments? Let me know in the comments section of today's show. One-word reaction for me right now. As I touched on, I get his logic, right? As somebody that isn't watching Cincinnati all the time, especially as a Chiefs guy, I get why you'd be like, oh, you fired Lou Anarumo. He's great in the playoffs. He's great against these elite quarterbacks. I get it. And I also get where you're like, okay, you're making all this fuss about paying T. Higgins and Jamar Chase and bringing back Trey Hendrickson. You had all those guys last year, and for the most part, they were all healthy, apart from, of course, T. Higgins a little bit early on in the season. You're bringing them back. What's to say that you're going to be able to get over the hump with the same guys coming back? Again, I totally get that logic. But at the same time, I disagree with what he's saying. To suggest that this offense is going to take a step back, to me, is very silly, right? The only way they take a step back is if number 9 gets hurt, or if 1 or 5 get hurt as well, but more specifically, if number 9 gets hurt, right? This is a unit that is developing lots of continuity. Something you saw with the Indianapolis teams when Peyton Manning was playing. Certainly saw it in New England as well with Brady and Edelman and Gronk. As you continue to bank years with each other, I mean, you get so advanced with the stuff that you are doing offensively. Joe Burrow kind of alluded to this in his press conference the other day as well. Things can get more complex because you have guys that have played together for so long. Is Joe Burrow going to throw for as many touchdowns next year? I don't know. Maybe not. But to say that the offense is going to take a step back, I think is really silly and quite, in fact, ridiculous as well. And also, now, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say the defense also can't be that bad. I get technically they could, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say they can't be that bad again, right? I've got a lot of faith and a lot of confidence in Al Golden. I get he's coming from the college ranks, but he's had success as a position coach in the NFL, and I think he's ready to do it as a coordinator as well. So that's kind of the biggest reason why I have pushback here from Nick Wright. And to suggest that they're not going to make the playoffs, to me, is crazy. You're going to say, oh, they're not going to win the Super Bowl, fine. But to say they're not going to win the playoffs, that's a little bit ridiculous in my opinion. But at the end of the day, let them keep sleeping, right? When we were talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, that's what everybody was doing in 21. What everybody was doing in 22, and you had incredible years there. And it's just part of being from Cincinnati, right? No matter what team you're talking about, whether it be the Reds, the Bengals, whatever, everybody is always going to sleep on Cincinnati, even if you have the best quarterback in the league as your quarterback. It's just what happens, and let them keep sleeping. And they're going to continue to sleep until you ultimately raise the Lombardi Trophy at the end of the day, and we will see when that time comes. Make sure you guys hit that sub button if you haven't done so already at youtube.com/Bengals TV. We will have you covered all training camp long and all season long as well. Don't miss out on any of our content. Hit that sub button right now.